Returning to An Introduction to the Philosophy of History by G.W.F. Hegel. 3. Freedom, the individual, and the state. If we think of reason in its relation to the world, then the question of the definition of reason in itself coincides with the question about the final goal of the world. Implicit in that latter term is the suggestion that the goal is to be realized, made actual. There are two things to be considered here: the content of that goal, i.e., the definition itself as such, and its actualization. At the outset, we must note that our object, world history, takes place in the realm of spirit. The term world includes both physical and mental nature. Physical nature impinges on world history as well, and from the very beginning we shall have to draw attention to the fundamental relations between the two natures in the definition. But it is spirit and the process of its development that is the substance of history. Nature in itself, which is likewise a rational system in its particular and characteristic element, is not our concern here except as related to spirit. Spirit is to be observed in the theater of world history, where it has its most concrete reality. In spite of this, however, or rather in order for us to grasp the universal aspect in this mode of spirit's concrete reality, we must set forth, before all else, some abstract definitions of the nature of spirit. These can, of course, be no more than mere assertions here. This is not the place to go into the idea of spirit in a speculative fashion, for what can be said in an introduction is simply to be taken historically as the presupposition which, as we said, has either been worked out and proven elsewhere, or else is to receive its verification only as the outcome of the science of history itself. We therefore have to address the following topics. Number 1. The abstract characteristics of the nature of spirit. Number 2. The means spirit uses in order to realize its idea. 3. The shape taken on by spirit in its complete realization in the world, the state. One. The nature of spirit. This can be seen by looking at its complete antithesis, matter. Just as the essence of matter is gravity, that is, in being determined by a force outside it, so the essence of spirit is its freedom, that is, in its self-determination. Everyone will immediately agree that spirit is endowed with freedom, among other characteristics. Philosophy, however, teaches us that all the characteristics of spirit subsist only by means of freedom, that all of them are only the means to freedom, and that they seek and produce only freedom. This is one of the truths of speculative philosophy, that freedom is the only truth of spirit. Matter has weight insofar as it strives towards a central point outside itself. It is essentially composed of parts which are separable. It seeks its unity, which would be its own negation, its opposite. If it were to achieve this, it would no longer be matter, but would have perished. It strives towards the ideal. For in unity, i.e., in being self-determining, self-moving, matter is idealized. Spirit, on the other hand, is that which has its center in itself. Its unity is not outside itself, rather it has found it within its own self. It is in its own self and alone unto itself, while matter has its substance, i.e., the source of support, outside itself. Spirit is autonomous and self-sufficient, a being by itself. Bei sich, selbst sein. But this precisely is freedom. For when I am dependent, I relate myself to something else, something which I am, as dependent. I cannot be without something which is external. I am free when I exist independently, all by myself. This self-sufficient being is self-conscious and consciousness of self. Two things must be distinguished in consciousness. First, the fact that I know, and second, what I know. In self-consciousness, the two, subject and object, coincide. Spirit knows itself. It is the judging of its own nature, and at the same time, it is the activity of coming to itself, of producing itself, making itself actually what it is in its self potentially. According to the abstract definition, we can say of world history that it is the exhibition of the spirit, the working out of the explicit knowledge of what it is potentially. Just as the germ of the plant carries within itself the entire nature of the tree, even the taste and shape of its truth, of its fruit. So the first traces of spirit virtually contain all history. Again, just as the germ of the plant carries within itself the entire nature of the tree, even the taste and shape of its fruit, so the first traces of spirit virtually contain all history. In the world of the ancient Orient, people do not yet know that the spirit, the human as such, is free. Because they do not know this, they are not free. They know only that one person is free, but for this very reason, such freedom is mere arbitrariness, savagery, stupefied passion, or even a softness or a tameness of passion, which is itself a mere accident of nature and therefore quite arbitrary. This one person is therefore only a despot, not a free man. It was among the Greeks that the consciousness of freedom first arose, and thanks to all that consciousness, they were free. But they, and the Romans as well, knew only that some persons are free, and not the human as such. Even Plato and Aristotle did not know this. Not only did the Greeks have slaves, therefore, the Greek life and their splendid freedom were bound up with this, but their freedom itself was partly a matter of mere chance, a transient and limited flowering, and partly a hard servitude of the human and the humane. It was first the Germanic peoples, through Christianity, who came to the awareness that every human is free by virtue of being human, and that the freedom of spirit comprises our most human nature. This awareness arose first in religion, in the innermost region of spirit. But to introduce this principle into worldly reality as well, that was a further task requiring long effort and civilization to bring it into being. For example, slavery did not end immediately with the acceptance of the Christian religion. Freedom did not suddenly prevail in Christian states, nor were governments and constitutions organized on a rational basis, or indeed upon the principle of freedom. This application of the principle of freedom to worldly reality, the dissemination of the principle so that it permeates the worldly situation, this is the long process that makes up history itself. I have already drawn attention to the distinction between a principle as such and its application, its introduction and implementation in the actuality of spirit and life. This distinction is fundamental to our science, and it must be kept in mind. Just as this distinction was noted in a preliminary way with regard to the Christian principle of self-consciousness and freedom, so it has its essential place in regard to the principle of freedom in general. World history is the progress in the consciousness of freedom, a progress that we must come to know in its necessity. Above, I made a general statement regarding the different levels in the awareness of freedom, namely that the Orientals knew only that one person is free, the Greeks and Romans that some are free, while we know that all humans are implicitly free, qua human. At the same time, this statement gives us the division of world history and the basis for our consideration of it. But this is noted merely provisionally and in passing. We must first explain some other concepts. The final goal of the world, we said, is the spirit's consciousness of its freedom, and hence also the actualization of that very freedom. This, then, is what characterizes the spiritual world, and this, therefore, is the substantially real world, to which the physical world is subordinate. Or to say this is speculative. Or to say this in speculative terms, the physical world has no truth as against the spiritual. Again, or to say this in speculative terms, the physical world has no truth as against the spiritual. But this freedom, as so far described, is itself indefinite and infinitely ambiguous. As the highest of concepts, it carries with it infinitely many misunderstandings, confusions, and errors, and comprises all possible excesses within it. Never has all this been better known and felt than at the present time. For the time being, however, we must content ourselves with using it in that general sense. We have also drawn attention to the importance of the infinite difference between the principle, which is as yet merely implicit, and that which is real. But at the same time, it is freedom in itself that contains the infinite necessity of bringing itself to consciousness, for in its very concept, it is knowledge of itself, and thereby to reality. Freedom is for itself the goal to be achieved, and the only goal of spirit. It is this final goal, freedom, toward which all the world's history has been working. It is this goal to which all the sacrifices have been brought upon the broad altar of the earth in the long flow of time. This is the one and only goal that accomplishes itself and fulfills itself, the only constant in the change of events and conditions, and the truly effective thing in them all. It is this goal that is God's will for the world. But God is the absolutely perfect being, and he can therefore will nothing but himself, his own will. Again, but God is the absolutely perfect being, and he can therefore will nothing but himself, his own will. The nature of his will, however, i.e. his own nature, that is what we are here calling the idea of freedom, since we are translating the religious image into philosophic thought. The question that now follows immediately, then, can be this: what means does this idea of freedom use for its realization? This is the second point to be considered. 2. The means of spirit. This question, as to the means whereby freedom develops itself into a world, leads us into the phenomenon of history itself. While freedom as such is primarily an internal concept, its means are external, namely the phenomena which present themselves directly before our eyes in history. Our first look at history convinces us that the actions of human beings stem from their needs, their passions, their interests, their characters, and talents. And it appears that the only springs of action in this theater of activity, and the mainsprings, are these needs, passions, and interests. Of course, the play also involves universal aims, benevolence, noble patriotism, and so on. But these virtues and their universality are insignificant in their relation to the world and its doings. We might well see the ideal of reason realized in these subjective individuals themselves and in their sphere of influence. But individuals are of slight importance compared to the mass of the human race. Likewise, the scope of their virtues is relatively restricted in its range. Instead, It is the passions, the aims of particular interest, the satisfaction of selfish desire that are the most forceful things. They get their power from the fact that they observe none of the limits which the law and morality would seek to impose upon them, and from the fact that these forces of nature are closer and more immediate to human beings than the artificial and tedious discipline toward order and moderation, toward law and morality. When we look at this drama of human passions and observe the consequences of their violence and of the unreason that is linked not only to them but also and especially to good intentions and rightful aims, when we see arising from them all the evil, the wickedness, the decline of the most flourishing nations mankind has produced, we can only be filled with grief, for all that has come to nothing. And since this decline and fall is not merely the work of nature, but of the will of men, we might well end with moral outrage over such a drama, and with a revolt of our good spirit, if there is a spirit of goodness in us. Without rhetorical exaggeration, we could paint the most fearful picture of the misfortune suffered by the noblest of nations and states as well as by private virtues, and with that picture we could arouse feelings of the deepest and most helpless sadness, not to be outweighed by any consoling outcome. We can strengthen ourselves against this, or escape it, only by thinking that, well, so that it was at one time, it is fate. There is nothing to be done about it now. And finally, in order to cast off the tediousness that this reflection of sadness could produce in us, and to return to involvement in our own life, to the present of our own aims and interests, we return to the selfishness of standing on a quiet shore where we can be secure in enjoying the distant sight of confusion and wreckage. But as we contemplate history as this slaughter bench upon which the happiness of nations and wisdom of states and the virtues of individuals were sacrificed, the question necessarily comes to mind: what was the ultimate goal for which these monstrous sacrifices were made? And from this there usually follows the question which we made the starting point of our consideration. And in this perspective, the events that present such a grim picture of our troubled feeling and thoughtful reflection have to be seen as the means for what we claim is the substantial definition, the absolute end goal, or equally the true result of world history. From the outset, we have altogether avoided taking the path that goes from the picture of the particular events to the universal meaning. In any case, it is no service to those emotional reflections to rise above those feelings, and in that way to solve the riddles of Providence, which the mournful view has given up on. It is far more characteristic of such reflections to enjoy the misery of the empty and fruitless sublimities of that negative outcome. We must return, therefore, to our original standpoint, and the elements that we wish to adduce will also contain the essential determinations through which the questions arising from the picture of human suffering can be answered. The first thing we note is what we have already remarked upon, but which cannot be repeated too often, since it concerns the matter at hand, namely, that what we have called the principle, the final goal, the determination, or the nature of the concept of spirit, is only something general and abstract. A principle or rule or law is something eternal which, whatever truth it has written, it is not completely actual. Aims, principles, and the like are to begin with in our thoughts, only in our inner intentions, but not yet to be found in reality. What is implicit in itself is a possibility, a potentiality, but it has not yet emerged from its own inwardness into outer existence. For actuality, there must be a second element added, and that is activity or actualization. The principle of this is the will, i.e., human activity in general. Only through this activity is the concept, along with its implicit determinations, realized, actualized, for these aims and principles are not immediately valid in and of themselves. The activity which puts them into operation and into existence is that which stems from human need, drive, inclination, and passion. I bring something into act, and being because it suits me to do so, I must be involved in it. In acting on my desires, I must be satisfied. A purpose for which I am to be active must be in some way be my purpose as well. My own purpose must in some way be satisfied in it, even if the purpose for which I am active also has many other aspects that do not concern me. This is the infinite right of the subjective individual to satisfy himself in his activity and work. If people are expected to have an interest in something, they themselves must be involved in it, and they must find their own sense of self satisfied in it. There is a misunderstanding to be avoided here. It may be said of an individual reproachfully that he is an interested party, namely, that he is out of his private advantage, without regard for the common interest. He cloaks his own advantage in it, and then sacrifices the common interest in favor of his own. Yet, one who is active in behalf of something is not merely interested, but is interested in it. Language expresses the difference correctly. Nothing happens, therefore, nothing is accomplished, unless the individuals involved are satisfied as well. They are particular persons, and this means that they have their own particular needs, drives, and interests. Among these needs, there is not only one's own need and will, but also one's individual insight, conviction, or at least one's own viewpoint. If the need for argument, for understanding, and for reasoning is at all aroused. Hence, people demand, as well, that if they are expected to be active in behalf of something, then it should be in accord with their views, so that their opinions can be in sympathy with it, whether in regard to the utility of it, or their own rights or advantage. This is especially an essential aspect of our time in which people are less drawn to something by their trust in authority and would prefer to devote their activity to a cause on the basis of their own understanding of it, their independent conviction and opinions. We say, therefore, that nothing at all has come to pass without the interest of those whose activity is involved in it. And since we call an interest a passion, then all of one's individuality, to the neglect of all other interests and purposes one might have, is placed in the service of some cause, and every fiber of one's being, every last ounce of willpower is committed to it, so that all of one's needs and forces are concentrated upon it. We must assert as a general proposition that nothing great has been accomplished in the world without passion. Again, we say, therefore, that nothing at all has come to pass without the interest of those whose activity is involved in it. And since we call an interest a passion, when all of one's individuality, to the neglect of all other interests and purposes one might have, is placed in the service of some cause, and every fiber of one's being, every last ounce of willpower is committed to it, so that all of one's needs and forces are concentrated upon it, we must assert as a general proposition that nothing great has been accomplished in the world without passion. There are two elements that enter into our topic. The first is the idea. The other is human passion. The first is the warp, the other the woof, in the great tapestry of world history that is spread out before us. The concrete meeting point and union of the two is in ethical freedom in the state. We have already spoken of the idea of freedom as the essential nature of spirit and the final goal of history. Passion is often seen as something that is not quite right, something more or less evil. The human being ought to have no passions, and the term passion is not quite the right word for what I want to express. What I generally understand by the word is human activity stemming from the individual interest, from special goals, or from self-seeking purposes, if you like. But passion occurs when people place the entire energy of their will and character in these goals, sacrificing something else that might well be a goal, or even everything else. Again, what I generally understand by this word is human activity stemming from individual interest, from special goals, or from self-seeking purposes, if you like. But passion occurs when people place the entire energy of their will and character in these goals, sacrificing something else that might be, well, a goal, or even everything else. This particular passionate content is so bound up with a person's will that it is inseparable from it and comprises all that determines it. Through it, the person is what he is. This particular passionate content is so bound up with a person's will that it is inseparable from it and comprises all that determines it. Through it, the person is what he is. What is there that the individual, not man in general? It is not man that exists, but the specific individual. The term character expresses this uniqueness of will and intelligence as well. But character embraces all the peculiarities of the person, the moods of behavior in private relationships, etc. And this very uniqueness is asserted in nothing other than a person's effectiveness and activity. I will therefore use the term passion to signify the particular uniqueness of a person's character, to the extent that the uniqueness of will does not have a merely private content, but is also what drives and motivates actions of a universal scope. Passion is primary to the subjective and thus the formal aspect of energy, of will and activity, so that the content or goal remains as yet undetermined. At the same time, it is there in one's own conviction, one's own insight and conscience. What matters is always the content of my conviction, the aim of my passion, and whether the one or the other is more genuine. But conversely, whichever is more genuine will enter in existence and become actual. From this comment above, the second essential element in the realization of a historical aim, it follows, if for a moment we look at the state, that the state is well constituted and internally strong if the private interest of the citizens is united with the universal goal of the state, so that each finds its fulfillment and realization in the other. This is a proposition of the highest intrinsic importance, but before this unity is brought into being, the state must undergo much struggle with private interests and passions, in a long and hard discipline of them. And the state needs many institutions, devices, and practical arrangements, together with long struggles of the understanding, before it arrives at an awareness of what is appropriate to its goal. The era of such a unity constitutes the period of a state's flowering, the time of its excellence, power, and prosperity. But world history does not begin with any conscious goal, such as we find in the particular spheres of human life. The simple social instinct of human beings already involves the conscious goal of securing life and property, and insofar as this life in common has already come into being, that goal is extended further. World history begins with its universal goal, the fulfillment of the concept of spirit, still only implicit, and seek, i.e., as its nature. That goal is the inner, indeed, the innermost unconscious drive, and the entire business of world history is, as we said, the work of bringing it into consciousness. Thus, what we call the subjective aspect needs drives, passions, particular interest, as well as opinions and subjective views. All this is immediately apparent to consciousness, Farseek, which makes its entrance in the guise of a natural being, or of natural will. This imponderable mass of wills, interests, and activities, these are the tools and means of the world spirit for achieving its goal, to elevate it to consciousness and to actualize it. And this goal is none other than to find itself, to come to itself, and to behold itself as actuality. But since those very life forms of individuals and nations, in seeking to satisfy their own interest, are at the same time the tools and means of something higher and greater, of which they know nothing and which they fulfill unconsciously, all this could well be questioned, and it has been questioned. It has been denied, decried, and scorned, in many ways as mere dreaming, mere philosophy. But on this question I have made my position clear from the very beginning. I laid down our presupposition, which is to appear only at the end, as the result of our investigation, and our belief that reason rules the world, which means that it has ruled history as well. Everything else is subordinate in relation to this universal and substantial reason, in and for itself. It serves that reason as its means. Moreover, this reason is eminent in historical existence, and fulfills itself in and through it. Again, moreover, this reason is immanent in historical existence, and fulfills itself in and through it. The union of the universal, existing in and for itself, with the individual subjective aspect, so that this union alone is the truth. All this is speculative, and it is handled in this general form in metaphysical logic. But in the course of the world history itself, conceived as being still on the march, the pure end goal of history is still not the content of need and interest, and although need and interest are unaware of the end goal, the universal is still implicit in particular goals and fulfills itself in them. The question as to the union of the universal and the subjective also takes the form of the union of freedom and necessity, for we regard the immanent development of spirit as necessary because it is in and for itself, while we ascribe to freedom whatever appears in the conscious will of human beings as their interest. Since the speculative metaphysical aspects of this connection belongs to the sphere of logic, we cannot analyze it here. We can only mention the main points relevant to it. It is demonstrated in philosophy that the idea proceeds to its infinite antithesis. On the one hand, there is the idea in its freely universal mode, wherein it remains self-sufficient, basic. And on the other hand, there is the idea as pure abstract reflection into itself, inseek, which is formal, being for itself, Verseek. The ego, or the formal freedom, which belongs only to spirit. Thus, on the one side, the universal idea subsists as the substantial totality of things, and on the other side as the abstractness of arbitrary free will. This reflection into itself is the individual self-consciousness. It is the other to the idea in general, and thus it subsists in absolute finitude. For this very reason, this other is the finitude, the determinate element for the universal absolute. It is the side of the absolute's existence, the ground of its formal reality, and the ground for the reverence due to God. To grasp the absolute bonding of this antithesis, that is the profound task of metaphysics. Moreover, with the general positing of this finitude, all particularity is positioned. again. Moreover, with the general positing of this finitude, all particularity is posited. In a formal sense, the will wills itself, asserting the singular ego in everything that it intends and does. Even the pious individual wants to be saved, to be blessed, thus asserting his selfhood. This pole of the antithesis, the individual existing for himself, is a particular entity, in contrast to the absolute universal essence, and it is as such that he knows this particularity of his and wills it. He is altogether at the standpoint of appearance. This is the sphere of particular aims, where the individuals assert themselves in their particularity, fulfilling it and actualizing it. Okay, backing up again. This pole of the antithesis, the individual existing for himself, is a particular entity, in contrast to the absolute universal essence, and it is as such that he knows this particularity of his and wills it. He is altogether at the standpoint of appearance. This is the sphere of particular aims, where the individuals assert themselves in their particularity, fulfilling it and actualizing it. This standpoint, then, is also the standpoint of happiness or unhappiness. That individual is happy who has accommodated his existence to his particular character, will, and arbitrariness, so that he enjoys himself in his existence. But world history is not the place for happiness. Periods of happiness are empty pages in history, for they are the periods of harmony, times when the antithesis is missing. As reflection into self, this freedom is altogether abstract. It is the formal element of the activity of the absolute idea. Activity is the unifying middle term of the syllogism. One pole is the universal, the idea that rests in the inner pit of spirit. The outer pole is externality, as such, objective matter. Activity is the middle term, which translates the universal and internal into external objectivity. I will try to make what I have said more evident and clear by giving some examples. Building a house is, to begin with, an inner goal and purpose. As the means to that end, there are particular materials: iron, wood, stone. The elements are applied in order to work up these materials: fire to melt the iron, air to blow up the fire, water to turn the wheels for cutting the wood, etc. The result is that the air, which helped in building the house, is now shut out by the house, since it excludes the wind. Similarly, the house keeps out streams of water because it excludes the rain, and insofar as the house is made fireproof, it excludes the destructiveness of fire. The stones and beams are obedient to Earth's gravity, and because they press downward, high walls are set up. Thus the elements are utilized according to their nature, and yet they cooperate toward a product by which they themselves are being limited. In a similar way, the human passions satisfy themselves. They fulfill their goals according to their natural determination, and they bring forth the evidence of human society, in which they have provided for law and order as forces against themselves, i.e., restraining those passions. The above-mentioned connection further entails the following, namely, that in world history the outcome of human actions is something other than what the agents aim at and actually achieve, something other than what they immediately know and will. They fulfill their own interest, but something further is thereby brought into being, something which is inwardly involved in what they do, but which was not in their consciousness or part of their intention. As an analogous example, let us consider the case of a man who, for revenge, and perhaps justly, i.e. in return for an unjust injury, sets fire to another man's house. The immediate act is thus linked to further effects on neighboring properties, i.e. effects which are in themselves external to the act and do not intrinsically belong to it. As such, the act involves merely the holding of a small flame to a small part of a roof beam. As yet, nothing more than this has been done, but further effects will follow of themselves. The ignited portion of the beam is connected to its other parts, and these to the woodwork of the entire house, this house to other houses nearby, and so a widespread conflagration ensues, which affects many more people than the one against whom the act of vengeance was directed, consuming their goods and property, and even costing many of them their lives. This result lay neither in the act as such nor in the intention of the man who started it all. But the action has yet another general aspect. The aim of the man who perpetrated the act of arson was to be revenged upon one individual through the destruction of his property. But arson is also a crime and entails a punishment. This may not have been in the consciousness of the perpetrator, still less in his intention. But this is entailed in his act in itself, and these are the universal substantial aspects of it that are brought about by it. It is precisely this that should be kept in mind in this example, that there can be something more involved in the immediate action than what is in the intention or the consciousness of the agent. Again, it is precisely this that should be kept in mind in this example, that there can be something more involved in the immediate action than what is in the intention or the consciousness of the agent. The example has a further implication, however. The substance of an action, and thus the action itself, can turn it against the agent, recoiling against him to destroy him. This union of the two poles, the realization of the universal idea in immediate actuality, and the elevation of the singular agency into universal truth, occurs first of all under the presupposition of the distinctness of the two sides and their indifference toward one another. In their actions, the agents have finite aims and particular interest, but they also know and think. The content of their aims is permeated by the universal and essential determinations of what is right, good, duty, etc. Bare desire, volition in its crude and savage form, falls outside the theater and sphere of world history. And these universal determinations, which are also the guidelines for aims and actions, have a specific content. For something as empty of content as the good or the goodwill has no place at all in living actuality. If men are to act, they must not only will the good, but they must also know whether this or that is good. But as for the question of just what is good or not good, right or not right, in the ordinary situations of private life, that question is answered by the laws and customs of a state. There is no great difficulty in knowing what these are. Every individual has his station in life, and he knows, on the whole, what the right and honorable course of action is. To declare in ordinary private relations that it is so difficult to choose what is right and good, to see a superior morality in finding difficulties and raising scruples, all this rather indicates an evil and perverse will. This is a will that seeks to evade its duties, which are not hard to know, or at best we may ascribe this to an idleness of thought, a small-minded will that gives itself not much to do, and thus falls into self-indulgence and moral smugness. The situation is quite different in regard to the great historical relations. It is here that we find the great collisions between On one hand, the system of established and recognized duties, laws, and rights, and on the other, the possibilities which stand opposed to that system. These are possibilities that are injurious to the established order, destroying its foundations and its very existence. Yet they have a content that can appear to be good, advantageous on the whole, even essential and necessary. These possibilities now become historical. They involve a universal concept, but one of the different sort from that which serves as the basis for the continued existence of a people or a state. This universal concept is a moving force of the productive idea, an element of the truth that is forever striving toward itself, pressing on toward itself. The historical men, the world historical individuals, are those whose aims embody a universal concept of this kind. The situation is quite different in regard to the great historical relations. It is here that we find the great collisions between, on one hand, the system of established and recognized duties, laws, and rights, and on the other, the possibilities which stand opposed to that system. These are possibilities that are injurious to the established order, destroying its foundations and its very existence. Yet they have a content that can appear to be good, advantageous on the whole, even essential and necessary. These possibilities now become historical. They involve a universal concept, but one of a different sort from that which serves as the basis for the continued existence of a people or a state. This universal concept is a moving force of the productive idea, an element of the truth that is forever striving toward itself, pressing on toward itself. The historical men, the world historical individuals, are those whose aims embody a universal concept of this kind. Caesar was such a man. At one point he was in danger of losing the position to which he had raised himself, a position, if not of predominance, at least of equality with the others who stood at the head of the state. Indeed, he was in danger of falling into the power of those who were about to become his enemies. These enemies, though they were pursuing their personal aims, had the formal state structure on their side, with all the might of apparent legality. Caesar fought to retain his position, honor, and security, and since his opponents held power over the provinces, Caesar's victory over these men amounted to the conquest of the entire Roman Empire. Thus, although he left the form of the state structure unchanged, Caesar became the sole ruler of the state. The accomplishing of his originally negative aim, i.e., the autocratic control of Rome, was at the same time an essential determination in the history of Rome and of the world. It was not only the achievement of his personal victory, it was also an instinct that fulfilled what the time intrinsically demanded. The great men in history are those whose own particular aims contain the substantial will that is the will of the world spirit. The can be called heroes. That's a misprint. T-H-E. It should read T-H-E-Y. They can be called heroes because they have drawn their aim and their vocation not merely from the calm and orderly system that is the sanctified course of things, but rather from a source whose content is hidden and has not yet matured into present existence. This source is the inner spirit, that is as yet hidden beneath the surface. It knocks at the outer world as though that were a shell, and shatters it, because that inner spirit is a kernel that is different from the kernel in the outer world's shell. Thus these men seem to create from within themselves, and their actions have produced a set of conditions and worldly relations which seem to be only their interest and their work. Again, thus, these men seem to create from within themselves, and their actions have produced a set of conditions and worldly relations which seem to be only their interest and their work. These heroic individuals, in fulfilling these aims of theirs, had no consciousness of the idea at all. On the contrary, they were practical and political men, yet at the same time they were thoughtful men, with insight into what was needed and what was timely. Their insight was the very truth of their time and their world, the next species, so to speak, which was already there in the inner source. It was theirs to know it, this universal concept, the necessary next stage of their world, to make this their aim, and to put their energy into it. The world historical men, the heroes of an era, are therefore to be recognized as the insightful ones. Their deeds and their words are the best of their time. Great men have worked to satisfy themselves, not others. Whatever they might have learned from others in the way of well-intentioned advice, all this would have been narrow-minded and distorted under the circumstances, for they were the ones who best understood what was right, and from them all the others learned it, and approved their actions, or at least accommodated themselves to them. The advanced spirit is thus the inner soul of all individuals, but this is an unconscious inwardness, which the great men bring to consciousness for them. This is why the others follow these soul leaders, for they feel the irresistible force of their own spirit coming out in the heroes. If we take another look at the final destiny of these world historical individuals who had the calling to manage the affairs of the world spirit, we find that their destiny was by no means happy. They attained no calm enjoyment. Their entire life was toil and trouble. Their entire nature was nothing but their master passion. Once their goal is achieved, they fall away like empty shells from the kernel. They die young. Like Alexander, they are murdered. Like Caesar, they are exiled. Like Napoleon to St. Helena. There is a horrible consolation in the fact that these historical men did not achieve what is called happiness, a happiness found only in private life, and under very external circumstances. And this is a comfort that can be drawn from history by those who need it. But those who need that consolation are also the envious, who resent greatness and eminence, who seek to belittle greatness and to find fault with it. Thus in modern times it has been demonstrated all too often that princes are not at all happy on their thrones, so that we are not to begrudge them their position, and are to be glad that it is they who are there, not we. The free man, however, is not envious, but gladly recognizes what is great and exalted, and rejoices in it. It is in the light of these general elements, therefore, elements that constitute the interest and thus the passions of individuals, that these historical men are to be regarded. Men are great for having willed and accomplished something great, not something based on conceit or presumptuousness, but rather something right and necessary. This standpoint excludes the so-called psychological view, which best serves the interest of envy, for it explains all actions as coming from some objective, subjective source, great or small, in the individual, some pathological craving for the sake of which all his actions are done, as though there never had been anyone who acted from moral motives. Again, this standpoint excludes the so-called psychological view, which best serves the interest of envy, for it explains all actions as coming from some subjective source, great or small, in the individual, some pathological craving for the sake of which all his actions are done, as though there never had been anyone who acted from moral motives. Alexander of Macedon conquered part of Greece, and then Asia. Therefore he must have had a craving for conquest, or he acted from a craving for fame. And the supposed proof that this is what drove him is that his actions did bring him fame. What schoolmaster has not demonstrated that Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar were driven by such passions, and that they were therefore immoral? And from this it immediately follows that he, the schoolmaster, is more admirable than they, since he has no such passions, the proof being that he has not conquered Asia, nor defeated Darius and Porus, but that he is willing to live and let live. These psychologists are particularly fond of latching on to the peculiarities of great historical figures as private persons. A man must eat and drink. He enters into relations with friends and acquaintances. He has feelings and moments of anger. As a familiar saying has it, no man is a hero to his valet. To this I added, and Goethe repeated it 10 years later, but not because the former is no hero, but because the latter is a valet. He takes off the hero's boots, helps him into bed, knows that he likes his champagne, etc. Served by such psychological valets in historical writing, the historical personage comes off badly. He is degraded, brought down to the valet level, or even a few degrees below the morality of these fine connoisseurs of humanity. Homer's Thersites, who reproaches the kings, is a typical figure for all times. True, Thersites does not always get thumped with a stout stick, as he does in the Homeric era. But envy and egotism, these are the thorns in his flesh, and the undying worm that gnaws at him is the torturing thought that his admirable intentions and criticisms remain altogether ineffectual in the world. One may even take a certain malicious pleasure at the ultimate fate of Thersites. A world historical individual is not so circumspect as to want this, that, and the other, and to take account of everything. Rather, he commits himself unreservedly to one purpose alone. So it happens that such individuals treat other interests, even sacred ones, in a casual way, a mode of conduct certainly open to moral censure. But so great a figure must necessarily trample on many an innocent flower, crushing much that gets in his way. The particular interest linked to passion is thus inseparable from the actualization of the universal principle, for the universal is the outcome of the particular and determinate, and from its negation, it is the particular that is involved in the struggle with others, and of which one part is doomed to perish. It is not the universal idea which involves itself in antithesis and struggle, exposing itself to danger. It remains in the background and is preserved against attack or injury. This may be called the cunning of reason, that it allows the passions to work for it, while what it brings into existence suffers loss and injury. This is the phenomenal world, part of which is negative, part positive. Compared to the universal, the particular is for the most part too slight in importance. Individuals are surrendered and sacrificed. The idea pays the ransom of existence and transience, not out of its own pocket, but with the passions of individuals. Some might find it acceptable to see individuals sacrificed along with their aims and fulfillments, consigning their happiness to the realm of chance, to which it belongs, and even to regard individuals altogether under the category of means to an end. Yet there is that aspect of theirs which we must refuse to see in this light, even for the sake of the highest goal, simply because there is that in individuals which is not to be made subordinate, but is something intrinsically eternal and divine. This is morality, ethics, religious commitment. Footnote. In this translation, moralitat is uniformly rendered as morality, and its cognates, sittlichkeit, is rendered as ethics, ethical life, or the ethical religionistat, religiosistat, spelled religiositat, is rendered as religious commitment or religiosity. Translator's note. End of footnote. Already, when we spoke of the role of individuals in the actualization of the rational goal, we touched upon the subjective aspect, the interest of individuals, their needs and drives, their views and insights. And although we said that this was the formal aspect in them, it has an infinite right to be satisfied. In speaking of a means, we at first imagine something merely external to the end, and having no part in it. But in actuality, even natural things in general, even the most common lifeless objects used as means, must already be such as to be appropriate to their end and must have something in common with it. Humans do not see themselves as the means for the goals of reason in that entirely external sense at all. On the contrary, not only do they use the occasion to satisfy their particular interest, whose content is different from that goal, but they also have a part in that rational goal itself. For that very reason, they are to be regarded as ends in themselves. They are not ends in themselves in the merely formal sense, like the world of living things in general, so that the individual life could be subordinated to human life in general, and might justifiably be used as a means to it. On the contrary, humans are ends in themselves with respect to the content of the goal of reason. This determines what we want to exclude from the category of means, morality, ethics, religion. In other words, the human being is an end in himself, only by virtue of the divine in him, by virtue of what, from the very outset, was called reason, and called freedom, too, because reason is self-activating and self-determining. And although we cannot go into the further development of it here, we assert that morality, ethics, and religion have their basis and their source in reason and freedom, so that they are intrinsically exalted above necessity and chance. But it must be said here that individuals, to the extent that they are aware of their freedom, are responsible for any ethical and religious deterioration, and for the weakening of ethics and religion. This is the seal of the absolutely high vocation of man, that he or she knows what is good and what is evil, and that it is for him or her to will either the good or the evil. It is the mark of the human, in other words, to be capable of bearing such responsibility not only for the evil but also for the good, and responsibility not only for this, that, or other thing, but responsibility for the good and evil stemming from his or her individual freedom. Animals alone are truly innocent. It would, however, take an extensive analysis, as extensive as that needed for the analysis of freedom itself, in order to rule out or avoid all the usual misunderstandings involved in saying that what is called innocence means ignorance of evil itself. When we contemplate the fate that virtue, the ethical, even religion, have suffered in history, we must not fall into the litany of lamentation about how the good and pious often, or even, for the most part, fare ill in the world, while the evil and wicked prosper by the term prosperity. One may understand a wide variety of things, including wealth, external honors, and the like. But when we speak of such things as though they were intrinsic goals, we still cannot make the so-called prosperity or misfortune of this or that single individual into an element of the rational world order. To this world goal, there often goes the demand, with more of a justification than any demand for the happiness or the good fortune of individuals, that good, ethical, and righteous goals should find their realization and security in that world goal, and under its auspices. What makes people morally dissatisfied, and this is a dissatisfaction upon which they pride themselves, is that they do not see the present as measuring up to the goals they hold as right and good. This applies especially to contemporary ideal models of political institutions, thus contrasting the way things are with the way they ought to be. Here, it is not the particular interest, not the passion, that demands to be satisfied, but rather the demands of reason, justice, and freedom. And once it is furnished with this title, the demand becomes haughty, and it is not only dissatisfied, all too easily, with world conditions, but even rebels against them. To appreciate such feeling and such purposes, one must examine the demands raised, the dogmatic opinions asserted. At no time, so much as in our own, have general principles and ideas been raised up with greater pretentiousness. History usually presents itself as a struggle of passions. In our time, although there is no lack of passion, history shows itself to some to be predominantly the struggle between justifiable ideas, and to others to be essentially the struggle of passions and subjective interests that merely pretend to have a higher justification of this kind. In the name of the final destiny of reason, these pretended demands for justification are taken as absolute goals, in the same way as religion, ethics, morality. As was said, nothing is more common today than the complaint that the ideals raised by fantasy are not being realized, that these glorious dreams are being destroyed by cold actuality. on their life voyage, these ideals smash up on the rock of hard reality. They can only be subjective, after all. They belong to that individuality of the solitary subject. Individualitat des Einzelnen, which takes itself for the highest and wisest. Ideals of that sort do not belong here, for what the individual, individuum, spins out for himself in his isolation, Einzelheit, cannot serve as law for the universal reality, just as the world's law is not for the single individual. Einzelnen, individuen, alone, who may come off much the worse for it. But by the term ideal, we also understand the ideal of reason, of the good, the true. Poets such as Schiller have presented these ideals in very moving and emotional ways, with the feeling of deep sorrow at the fact that they may never be realized. If, on the contrary, we say that universal reason does manifest itself in the world, then this certainly has nothing to do with any empirical detail, for that can be better or worse, since the elements of contingency, of particularity, receive from the idea the power to exercise their tremendous authority in that sphere. There is much to find fault with, therefore, in the details of the world of appearances. This subjective fault-finding, which is concerned only with the detail and its shortcomings, and does not recognize the universal reason in it, is all too easy. Having the assurance of its good intentions for the well-being of the totality, together with the appearance of good-heartedness, it can give itself airs and make much of itself. It is easier to discern the shortcomings in individuals, in states, in providence, than to see their true significance. For in negative fault-finding, one stands above the thing, nobly and with a superior air, without being drawn into it, i.e., without having grasped the thing itself in its positive aspect. Generally, the critic mellows with age. Youth is always dissatisfied. That mellowness of age is a ripeness of judgment, which not only accepts the bad through disinterestedness, but is also led to what is substantial and solid in the matter in question by having been instructed more deeply by the seriousness of life. The insight to which philosophy ought to lead, therefore, in contrast to what happens to those ideals, is that the real world is as it ought to be, that the truly good, the universal divine, reason, is also the power capable of actualizing itself. This good, this reason, in its most concrete representation, is God. God governs the world. The content of his governance, the fulfillment of his plan, is world history. Philosophy seeks to understand this plan, for only what is fulfilled according to that plan has reality. What is not in accord with it is but a worthless existence. In the pure light of this divine idea, which is no mere ideal, the illusion that the world is a mad or foolish happening disappears. Philosophy seeks to know the content, the actuality of the divine idea, and to justify the despised reality, for reason is the perception of God's work. As for the deterioration, the damage, the decline of religious, ethical, and moral aims and conditions in general, we must say this. Although these values are infinite and eternal in their inner essence, their external expressions can take on limited forms, which in their natural interrelatedness subsist under the command of contingency. This is why they are transitory and exposed to deterioration and damage. Religion and the ethical, like any other inherently universal essences, have the characteristic of being present in the individual soul according to their concept, and therefore truly, even if they do not have in that soul the advantage of the full extent of culture or the application to fully developed circumstances. The religiosity or the ethics in a limited mode of life of a shepherd, say, or of a peasant, limited in their concentrated inwardness to a few and altogether simple circumstances of life, has infinite value, the same value as the religiosity and ethics of a cultivated intellect, and of an existence that is rich in the scope of its relations and activities. This inner center, this simple region of the rights of subjective freedom, the seat of volition, resolution, and action, and of the abstract content of conscience, embracing the responsibility and worth of the individual, all this remains untouched, entirely removed from the loud noise of world history, removed not only from the external and temporal changes, but also from those changes that are entailed by the absolute necessity of the concept of freedom itself. In general, however, there is this point to be noted, that whatever can claim to be noble and grand in the world still has something higher above it. The claim of the world spirit supersedes all particular claims. This may suffice in regard to the means used by the world spirit for the realization of its concept. Simply and abstractly, the means is the activity of those in whom reason is present as their intrinsically substantial essence, though primarily as a still obscure ground, one that is hidden from them. The matter becomes more complex and more difficult, however, when we regard individuals not merely as active, but more concretely, with the more definite content of their religion and ethics. For these factors have a part in reason, and hence in its absolute rights. Here the bare relation of means to an end falls away, and the principal points of view that have arisen regarding the bearing of the absolute goal of spirit upon this aspect of life have been briefly considered. Three, the state as realization of spirit. The third point to be considered is the goal to be achieved by these means, i.e., the form it takes in actuality. We have spoken of means, but in the fulfillment of a finite subjective goal, there is also a material element, which is already there or must be provided for the actualization. On this analogy, the question would be, what is the material in which the rational end goal is to be realized? Again, it is primarily the human subject, human needs, subjectivity in general. The rational comes to existence in human knowing and willing, as its material. We have considered the subjective will, how it has an aim which is made the truth of a reality, and especially in so far as this is a great world historical passion. As a subjective will, with limited passions, the human will is dependent, and it can only satisfy its particular aims within the limits of this dependency. Yet the subjective will also has a substantial life of its own, an actuality within which it moves among essences, and has the essential itself as the goal of its existence. This essential being is itself the union of two wills, the subjective will and the rational will. This is an ethical totality, the state. It is the reality wherein the individual has and enjoys his freedom, but only insofar as he knows, believes, and wills the universal. Yet we ought not to understand this as though the subjective will of the individual came to its fulfillment and enjoyment by way of the common or universal will, with the common will serving as a mere means for the individual, as if the individual were to limit his freedom among other individuals, so that the mutual limitation and inconvenience would provide for each some small space for movement. As against the negative concept of freedom, it is rather law, ethical life, the state, and they alone that comprise the positive reality and satisfaction of freedom. The freedom which is limited in the state is that of caprice, and the freedom that relates to the particularity of individual needs. Again, the freedom which is limited in the state is that of caprice, the freedom that relates to the particularity of individual needs. The subjective will, passion, is the actuating element and realizing force of reason. The idea is the inner source. The state is the externally existing, genuinely ethical life. Again, the subjective will, passion, is the actuating element and realizing force of reason. The idea is the inner source. The state is the externally existing, genuinely ethical life. It is the union of the universal, essential will with the subjective will, and this is ethics. The individual living in this union has his own ethical life. He has a value consisting in the substantiality alone. Sophocles, Antigone, says, "The divine commands are not of yesterday, nor of today. No, they live forever, and no one can say whence they came." The laws of ethics are not accidental, but are the rational itself. The proper goal of the state is to make this substantiality count in the actual doings of human beings and in their convictions, making it present and self-sustaining there. It is the absolute interest of reason that this ethical whole should be present, and herein lies the justification and the merit of the heroes who founded states, no matter how crude. In world history, we are concerned only with those peoples that have formed states, for we must understand that the state is the realization of freedom, i.e., of the absolute end goal, and that it exists for its own sake. We must understand further that all the value that human beings possess, all of their spiritual reality, they have through the state alone. Their spiritual reality consists in the fact that their essence, rationality, is objectively there for them as knowers, and that rationality has an immediate objective existence for them. Only in that way is man a consciousness with an ethical way of life, the legal and ethical life of the state. For the true is, as we said, the union of the universal, or general, will the subjective will, and the universal dimension is in the state's laws, in the universal and rational arrangements. The state is the divine idea, as it exists on earth. In this perspective, the state is the precise object of world history in general. It is in the state that freedom attains its objectivity and lives in the enjoyment of this objectivity. For the law of the state is the objectification of spirit. It is will in its true form. Only the will that is obedient to the law is free, for it obeys itself, and being self-sufficient, it is free. Insofar as the state, our country, constitutes a community of existence, and insofar as the subjective will of human beings submits to laws, the antithesis between freedom and necessity disappears. The rational is the necessary, the substantiality of the shared existence, and we are free to the extent that we acknowledge it as law, and follow it as the very substance of our being. The objective and the subjective will are then reconciled as one and the same serene whole. The ethical life of the state is not of the moral or reflective kind, wherein one's individual conviction rules supreme. This latter is more appropriate to the modern world. The true ethics of antiquity is rooted in the principle of abiding by one's duty. An Athenian citizen did what was required of him as if by instinct. But if I reflect upon the object of my activity, I must have the consciousness that my will has been called upon. Ethical life, however, is the sense of duty, unquestioned, unconscious, the substantial law, a second nature, as it has rightly been called, since the first nature of human beings is our immediate animal being. Again, ethical life, however, is the sense of duty, unquestioned unconsciousness. Again, ethical life, however, is the sense of duty, unquestioned, unconscious, the substantial law, a second nature, as it has rightly been called, since the first nature of human beings is our immediate animal being. The detailed development of the concept of the state is for the philosophy of right to provide, although we must point out that in the legal theories of our time various errors are current which are taken for established truths and have become prejudices. We will mention just a few, principally those related to the goal of our philosophical study of history. A. The theory that confronts us first is the direct contrary to our concept of the state as the actualization of freedom, namely the view that the human being is free by nature, but that in society and in the state, of which he is necessarily a part, he must limit this natural freedom of his. That the human being is free by nature is entirely correct, in the sense that he is free according to the concept of humanity. But for that very reason man is free only in terms of his implicit destiny, which is there to be fulfilled. The nature of a thing always amounts to the same thing as its concept, but it is true that the concept of humanity does include the way the human being exists in his merely natural, immediate existence. The theory before us assumes generally a state of nature. Man is represented as possessing natural rights and enjoying the unlimited exercise of his freedom. This assumption is not directly taken for historical fact. There would also be some difficulty, if it were taken seriously, in providing a proof that any such a natural condition existed in the present or anywhere in the past. One can certainly point to the existence of savage conditions, but these are shown to be linked to the passions, to barbarism and acts of violence, and yet these are linked, however primitive they are, to social institutions involving so-called limitations of freedom. The assumption is one of those nebulous images necessarily produced by the theory, i.e., the image of the noble savage, to which is ascribed existence without historical justification. What we find such a state of nature to be in its empirical existence corresponds equally well to the concept of it. Freedom as the ideal dimension of original nature does not exist as an original and natural state. On the contrary, it must first be achieved and won, and indeed won, through an endless process involving the discipline of knowledge and will. So the state of nature is not an ideal condition, but a condition of injustice, of violence, of untamed natural drives in human acts and emotions. There is, to be sure, a limitation imposed upon the state of nature by society and the civil state, but it is no more than a limiting of blunt emotions and crude impulses, as well as the limiting of the reflective arbitrariness of caprice and passion. This limitation is part of the process through which the eventual consciousness of freedom and will to be truly free, according to the concept of freedom, i.e. as rational, is first brought forth. According to that concept, freedom involves law and morality, and these are, in and for themselves, universal essences, objects, and aims. These must first be found through the activity of self-developing thought, in opposition to sense experience. Then they must be absorbed and incorporated into the primarily sensuous will, even against its natural inclination. Freedom is forever misunderstood in this way, being known in only a formal subjective sense, abstracted from its essential objects and aims. This is why the limiting of the impulses, desires, passions that are proper to the particular individual, as such, the limiting of arbitrary caprice, is taken to be limiting of freedom. Again, this is why the limiting of the impulses, desires, passions that are proper to the particular individual, as such, the limiting of arbitrary caprice, is taken to be a limiting of freedom. On the contrary, such limitation is simply the condition from which emancipation proceeds, and society and the state are the conditions wherein freedom is actualized. B. There is a second theory to be mentioned, and this denies the general development of abstract right into the form of law, the patriarchal condition prevailing either in the entire human race or at least in some single branches of it. It is regarded as the situation in which the ethical and emotional element finds its fulfillment along with the element of abstract right. Only in connection with these ethical and emotional elements, says this theory, can justice be truly exercised in accord with its content. The patriarchal condition is based upon the family relation, in which the absolutely primitive form of ethical life is consciously developed, followed by the higher form in the state. The patriarchal relation is a transitional condition, the family having grown into a tribe or a people. The unifying bond has ceased to be the bond of love and trust and has become one of service. Here we must speak primarily of the ethics of family life. The family may be seen as a single person. In that case, its members have either surrendered their personal claims against one another, along with their legal claims, their extended personal interest, and their selfishness, as in the case of parents, or else they have not yet arrived at the point of asserting such claims against one another, as in the case of children who are initially in that state of nature discussed above. They are therefore immersed in a unity of feeling, of love, of trust, and faith in one another. In this union of love, the individual has the consciousness of self in the consciousness of the other. The individual self is externalized, and In this mutual externalization, the individual has won selfhood, and each has gained the other's self with his or her own, since each is at one with the other. The further interest involved in the needs and external concerns of life, along with the internal development of those interests in regard to the children, constitute a common purpose for the family. The spirit of the family, e.g., in the Roman penates, is as much one substantial entity as is the spirit of a people in their state. In both, ethical life consists in the feeling, the consciousness, and the will, not of the individual personality and its interest, but of the common personality and interest of all the members in general. But in the family, this unity is one of feeling, remaining within the limits of the natural order of things. This piety of family feeling has to be respected to the highest degree by the state. As a result of this family feeling, the state has, as its members, individuals who are already ethical in themselves, which they would not be as self-interested persons, and as its members, they bring to the state its solid foundation, because each one feels himself to be united with the totality. But the extension of the family to a patriarchal whole goes beyond blood ties, the natural aspect, and outside these ties, individuals must assume the status of distinct persons. If we were to consider the patriarchal relation in its wider scope, we would be led to a discussion of theocracy. The head of the patriarchal tribe is also its priest. Where the family has not yet been distinguished from civil society and the state, the separation of religion from the family has not yet happened either, and insofar as the piety of family feeling itself remains an inwardness of feeling, it is not likely to happen. We have considered two aspects of freedom, the objective and the subjective. Now, if freedom means that the individuals give their consent, then it is easy to see that only the subjective element is meant. What follows naturally from this principle is that no law can be valid unless everyone agrees to it. And immediately we come to the implication that the minority view must yield to the majority. The greater number decides. But then, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau noted, there is no longer any freedom, since the will of the minority is no longer taken into account. In the Polish parliament, each individual member had to consent before a law was passed, and for the sake of that freedom, the state collapsed. Moreover, it is a false and dangerous assumption that only the people possess reason and insight and know what is right. Any faction of the people can put itself forward as standing for the people. But what really constitutes a state is a matter of trained intelligence, not a matter of the people. If the only criterion of political liberty is the principle of the will of the individual, namely that each individual is to give his or her consent to everything done by or for the state, and that without such unanimous consent no decision can be taken, then there is actually no such thing as an independent form of government operating autonomously. Presumably, the only arrangement that would then be needed would be, first, a neutral center, without any will, that would note what seemed to it to be the needs of the state, and would communicate its views, and second, the mechanism for assembling all individuals, and tabulating their votes for the various propositions before them. In that way, the decision would be already made. The state is an abstraction, having its merely general reality in its citizens, but it is actual, and its merely general existence must define itself as an individual will and activity. This creates the need for government and administration in general, involving the selection of individuals to take the helm of political affairs. They must take decisions about these matters, determine how those decisions are to be carried out, and direct the citizens in the implementation of them. Thus, even in a democracy, if the people decide to embark on war, there must be a general to lead the army. Only by means of a state structure does the abstraction that is the state acquire life and actuality, and in any such structure there is a difference between those who command and those who obey. Obedience, however, seems to be inconsistent with freedom, and those who are in command seem to be doing precisely what contradicts the concept of freedom, which is the very basis of the state. If, then, the difference between commanding and obeying is a necessary one, because otherwise nothing would get done, though indeed this seems only a matter of necessity, something external and contrary to freedom abstractly understood, then the institutions of government must at least be such that as few as people of the citizens have merely to obey, and the authorities have a little arbitrary power as possible. The range within which commanding authority is necessary should be for the people to decide. In its main outline, it should be determined by the will of the many, or of every individual citizen, for in that way the state, as an actuality and as an individuated unity, will gain its force and strength. The primary consideration, above all, is the difference between those who govern and those who are governed. The forms of governance have been correctly classified into monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Here we must note, however, that monarchy itself can be divided again into despotism and monarchy proper. In all these merely conceptual classifications, it is only the fundamental differences that are emphasized. These are therefore not to be taken as exhausting the concrete possibilities of forms, types, or modes of government. It is significant that the types of government admit the many variations, not only as subtypes of the above, but also as mixtures of these essential types of order, mixtures which are formless, untenable, and inconsistent distortions of those forms. In this clash of forms, therefore, the question is, which is the best form of government? That is, through what arrangements, organization, or mechanism of state power is the intrinsic purpose of the state fulfilled most effectively? Of course, this purpose can be seen in a variety of ways, e.g., as the calm enjoyment of civil life, or as universal happiness. Goals of this kind have resulted in the formulation of so-called ideals of government, including ideals involving the education of princes, Fenelon, or of the rulers as the aristocracy in general, Plato. The main emphasis as on the nature of those who stand at the head of the state, and in ideal accounts of this kind, no thought was given to the content of the state's organic institutions. The question as to the best form of government is often stated not only as though the theory about it is a matter of free subjective conviction, but also as though the actual introduction of one form, as the one recognized to be best or a better one, were the consequence of an entirely theoretical decision, as though the type of government were nothing more than a matter of free choice determined by reflection. In this altogether naive sense, the Persian leaders, though not the Persian people, deliberated about what form of government they wished to introduce into Persia. They had conspired to overthrow the false Smerdes and the Magi, and after the success of the conspiracy, they deliberated on the form of government because there was no heir to the throne, and Herodotus tells the story of that deliberation with the same naivete. Nowadays, the form of government of a land or a people is not represented as being so entirely dependent on their free choice. The underlying conception of freedom regarded abstractly has led to the widespread acceptance of the theory that the republic counts as the only just and genuine form of government. And there are many men who, despite the fact that they occupy high posts in monarchical systems of government, are not opposed to the idea of a republic or even support it. Again, and there are many men who, despite the fact that they occupy high posts in monarchical systems of government, are not opposed to the idea of a republic and even support it. Yet they realize that although the republic may be the best of systems, it cannot be instituted everywhere. And so they realize that people being what they are, we must be content with less freedom, and that under existing circumstances, given that moral condition of the people, the most useful form of government may be monarchy. Even in this view, although the necessity of a certain form of government is seen to be dependent on the condition of a people, that condition itself is regarded only as the result of external contingency. Such a view is based on the intellectually reflective decision between the concept and its reality. Either the intellect holds to a merely abstract and hence untrue concept, or it does not grasp the idea itself, or what amounts to the same thing in terms of content, though not in formal terms. The intellect lacks a concrete awareness of what a people or a state is. Further on, we shall show that a people's form of government comprises one substance, one spirit, with its religion, its art and philosophy, or at least with its thoughts and imaginings, its culture in general, not to mention other influences of an external sort, such as the climate, its neighbors, its place in the world. A state is an individual totality, from which it is impossible to isolate all itself a particular aspect, such as its form of government, although that aspect is of the highest importance. No one aspect is to be deliberated upon and voted upon in that isolated form. Not only is the form of government intimately connected with those other spiritual forces and dependent upon them, but the characterization of the entire spiritual individuality, including all its powers, is only one element in the history of the totality. It has been predetermined in the course of that history, and its history comprises the highest sanction of the Constitution as well as its highest necessity. The first formation of a state is authoritarian and instinctive, yet even force, obedience, and fear of a despotic ruler already involve some connection of wills. In the primitive state, it is already the case that the particular will of the individuum does not count. One's own particularity, particularitat, is set aside, and the universal will, allgemeine Wille, is what is essential. This unity of the universal and the individual, einzelne, is the idea itself, which is now present as the state and which goes on to develop itself further. The abstract, although necessary, course in the development of truly independent states, therefore, is that they begin with monarchy, whether it be patriarchal and pastoral or warlike. Then, peculiarity, Besonderheit, and individuality, Einzelnheit, assert themselves in aristocracy or democracy. The conclusion of the process is that this particularity is subjected to one power which can be no other than constitutional monarchy, such that the particular spheres have their independence apart from it. Thus we must distinguish between a first and second form of monarchy. This progression is a necessary one, such that each form of government in the sequence is not a matter of choice, but rather is such as to conform to the spirit of the people. What is important in deciding on the form of a state is constitution, is the development of the rational condition, i.e., the political condition as such, the liberation of the conceptual elements so that the particular powers are separated from one another and become complete in themselves, yet in their very freedom, cooperating toward one purpose and being sustained by it, in short, forming an organic whole. Thus the state is freedom subsisting on its own account, rationally self-conscious and objectively knowing itself to be such. Its objectivity is in the very fact that its elements are not merely present in a set of ideals, but are rather to be found in a characteristic reality. And in their effective self-realization, these elements pass over into that activity whereby the totality, the soul, the individual unity is produced as their result. The state is the idea of spirit in the externalized form of human will and its freedom. It is in the state, therefore, that historical change occurs essentially, and the elements of the idea are reflected in the state as various political principles. The forms of government in which the world historical peoples have blossomed are characteristic of those peoples. Thus the various forms do not present one universal basis of government, as though the differences consisted only in determinate modes of expression and development of this universal basis. Rather, there is a difference here in the underlying principles themselves. Accordingly, when we compare the forms of government of ancient world historical peoples, there is nothing they can tell us regarding the ultimate principle of the state as a principle that would be applicable to our own time. In fields of science and art, the matter is quite different. Ancient philosophy provides the basis for modern philosophy to such a degree that the ancient is contained in the modern. The relationship that appears here is that of an unbroken development of one edifice, whose foundation, walls, and roof have remained the same. And in art, that of the Greeks set the highest standard just as it is. But in regard to the types of government, the situation is quite different. The ancient and the modern have no essential principle in common. To be sure, there are abstract definitions and doctrines concerning lawful government, to the effect that intelligence and virtue should rule. These ideas are certainly shared, yet nothing is more misguided than to look for models among the Greeks, the Romans, or Orientals for the constitutional structures of our own time. From Oriental culture we have fine pictures of patriarchal conditions, paternalistic government, and devotion on the part of peoples. From the Greeks and Romans we have descriptions of popular freedom, where the constitution admitted all citizens to participation in the deliberations and decisions concerning general affairs and laws. This is the general opinion in our time as well, but with the modification that since our states are so large and the population so multitudinous, the people must express its will, not directly but indirectly, through its representatives, who contribute to decisions concerning public affairs and laws. The so-called representative system of government is the logical form to which we link our image of a free system, and this link has become a firm prejudice. In it, the people are separated from the government. But there is something malicious in this antithesis. It is a trick of bad will, suggesting that the people are the totality of the state after all. Underlying this idea, moreover, is the principle of individuality, the absoluteness of subjective will, which we discussed above. The main point against this mistake is that this freedom, as defined by its concept, is not based on subjective will and caprice as its principle, but on the insight into the universal will, and that the system of freedom is the free development of its elements. Subjective will is an entirely formal concept, which does not in any way entail what is that is willed. Again, subjective will one more time. Subjective will is an entirely formal concept, which does not in any way entail what it is that is willed. Only the rational will is this universal will, which determines and develops itself in itself, and unfolds its elements as its organic parts. Again, only the rational will is this universal will, which determines and develops itself in itself, and unfolds its elements as its organic parts. The ancients knew nothing of this Gothic intellectual architecture of reason. Earlier, we set up two elements for consideration. The first was the idea of freedom as the absolute end goal. The second was the means to that end, the subjective aspect in knowing and willing, with all their vitality, movement, and activity. Then we went on to see the state as the ethical whole. Then we went on to see the state as the ethical whole and the reality of freedom, and hence as the objective unity of both those preceding elements. For although we have distinguished the two sides for the purpose of our discussion, it must be carefully noted that they cohere together exactly, and that this mutual entailment is to be found in each of the two elements when we examine each separately. On one hand, we have recognized the idea in its determinacy as the freedom that knows and wills itself, and has only itself as its goal. This is the simple concept of reason, and at the same time, it is what we call the subject, self-consciousness, the spirit as it exists in the world. If, on the other hand, we consider subjectivity itself, we find that the process of subjective knowing and willing is nothing other than thinking. But insofar as I thoughtfully know and will, I will the universal object, the substance of what is in and for itself rational. Thus we see the intrinsic unification of the object aspect, the concept with the subjective aspect. The objective existence of this unification is the state, which is therefore the basis and the center of the other concrete aspects of the life of a people, its art, its laws, its ethics, its religion, its science. All spiritual activity has this goal alone, to make itself aware of this unification, i.e., of its freedom. Among the different forms of this conscious unification, combining the objective and the subjective, religion stands at the pinnacle. Here the existing worldly spirit becomes aware of the absolute spirit, and in this consciousness of the essence in and for itself, the human will renounces its particular interest. In devotion, all this is set aside, and there is no longer any concern with particulars. Through acts of sacrifice, we express our renunciation of our property, of our will, and of our particular perceptions. The religious concentration of mind appears as feeling, yet it also goes over into meditation. Active worship is meditation externalized. In art, we have the second form of the unification of the objective and the subjective in spirit. Art enters more into actuality and sense experience than religion does. In its noblest posture, it is there to present not the mind of God, of course, but the outer form of God, and thus the divine and the spiritual as such. Through art, the divine becomes visible to fantasy and to sight. The true, however, does not just achieve representation and feeling, as in religion, and the visual, as in art. It also comes to the thinking spirit, and we thereby arrive at the third form of the unification, philosophy, the highest, the freest, and the wisest configuration of spirit. We cannot propose to consider these three configurations here. All we can do is mention them, since they occupy the same ground as does the object of our study, the state. The universal dimension that manifests itself in the state and is known in it, the form which is to include all that is, comprises the culture of a nation taken together. Again, the universal dimension that manifests itself in the state and is known in it, the form which is to include all that is, comprises the culture of a nation taken all together. The specific content, however, which takes on the form of universality and which inheres the concrete, the specific content, however, which takes on the form of universality and which inheres in the concrete, actually, that is the state, is the spirit of the people itself. The actual state is animated by this spirit in all its particular affairs, wars, institutions, etc. But man must also know of this spirit of his as his own essence, and create for himself the consciousness of his own unity with it, a unity that is fundamental. For we said that the ethical is the union of the subjective and the universal will. Spirit, however, must come to an explicit consciousness of this union, and the center point of such knowing is religion. Art and philosophy are only the different aspects and forms of this same content. In considering religion, the question is whether it knows the true, the idea, in its division or in its true unity. As the idea in its division, religion knows God as the abstractly supreme being, the Lord of heaven and earth, above and beyond all else, and excluded from human actuality. As the idea in its unity, religion knows God as the unity of universal and individual Einzelne, since in him the individual is seen positively as well in the idea of the incarnation. Religion is the place wherein a people gives itself the definition of what it holds to be true. The definition comprises everything belonging to the essentiality of the object, and in it the nature of the object is reduced to a simple basic determination, as the mirror of all determinacy, the universal soul of all particular things. Thus the representation of God constitutes the general foundation of a people, i.e., of its conscious unity. In this aspect, religion stands in the closest connection to the principle of the state. There can be freedom only where individuality individualitat, is recognized as a positive aspect of the divine being. But there is a further connection between religion and the state, on the negative side, Secular reality is seen as merely temporal, as motivating itself in individual interest, in einzelnen Interessen, and therefore as relative and having no justification. Secular reality is justified only insofar as its absolute soul, its principle, is justified absolutely, and it receives this justification only by being recognized as the manifestation of the essence of God. It is for this reason that the state rests upon religion. In our time, we hear this repeated often, that the state rests on religion, and most of the time nothing more is meant than that God-fearing individuals are more inclined and ready to do their duty because obedience to the sovereign and the law is so easily linked to the fear of God. Certainly the fear of God, by placing the universal aim above the particular individual, can also turn against the latter, can become fanatical and act against the state, burning its buildings and destroying its institutions. So, the received opinion is that the fear of God should be moderated and should be held with a certain coolness, lest it turn against what is supposed to be protected and maintained by it, and overwhelm it in a storm. Religion has within it at least the possibility of doing just that. Having arrived at the correct conviction that the state rests on religion, religion can take the position that the state is already there, and that in order to maintain the state, religion must be brought in buckets and bushels to be impressed on people's minds. It is entirely correct that people should be trained in religion, but not in something that is not yet there. For when we say that the state is founded on religion, that the state has its roots in religion, then we mean essentially that religion is prior, and that the state has arisen from it and continues to do so. Or, in other words, the state's principles must be regarded as valid in and for themselves, and they can only be regarded inasmuch as they are acknowledged to be determinations of the divine nature itself. Thus, whatever the nature of the shared religion may be, the nature of the state and its structure must agree with it. The state has truly arisen from the religion in the sense that the Athenian or the Roman state, for example, was possible only in the context of the specific paganism of these peoples. Similarly, a Catholic state will have a spirit and structure that are different from those of a Protestant state. That call, that urge and drive to implant religion in the state could be taken as a cry of fear and distress, as it so often seems to be, expressing the danger that religion is about to disappear from the state or has already done so. But in that case, the situation would be serious, even more serious than the call intends, for in it there is the belief that religion can be implanted and inculcated as a defense against evil. But religion is not at all such an instrument. As an instrument in the production of itself, the self-productive process goes far deeper. Another and quite opposite foolishness we meet with in our own time is that of trying to invent and institute types of government without taking account of religion. The Catholic religion, although like Protestantism, it is a form of Christianity, does not ascribe to the state the inherent justice and ethical status that lie the inwardness of the Protestant principle. That sondering of constitutional law from the ethical arises necessarily from the very nature of Catholicism, which does not recognize law and the ethical as independent, as substantial, But these constitutional principles and institutions, once they are torn away from the inwardness, from the last sanctuary of conscience, the quiet place where religion resides, do not have an actual conscious center, because they remain abstract and indefinite. Let us now sum up what we have said about the state. The vitality of the state in the individual citizens is what we have called its ethical life. The laws and institutions of the state are the rights of its citizens, its nature, its soil, its mountains, air, and waters. These are their land, their country, their outward property. The history of the state is in their acts, and what their ancestors have achieved belongs to the citizens of today, and lives in their memory. All of this is their possession, just as they are possessed by it, for it constitutes their substance, their being. Their imagination is filled with all this, and their will is the willing of these laws and its country. It is the temporal whole that constitutes one being, the spirit of one people. To it belong the individual citizens. Each individual is the child of his people, and likewise the child of his time, insofar as the state is seen to be in the process of developing. No one is left behind by his time, nor can he overstep it. This spiritual entity is his very own, and he is representative. It is that context in which he stands, and from which he goes forth. Among the Athenians, Athens had a double meaning. First, it meant the totality of its institutions, but then also the goddess who displayed the spirit of the people, its unity. This spirit of a people is the determinate spirit, and it is also determined by the historic stage of its development, as we have just said. This spirit, therefore, constitutes the basis and the content of its self-consciousness, in the various forms of which we have spoken, i.e., art, religion, and philosophy. For in its consciousness of itself, spirit must be objective to itself, and objectivity immediately involves the emergence of differences which subsist as the totality of all the differentiated spheres of objective spirit. In the same way, the soul exists only insofar as it is an organization of its members, which, by taking themselves together in its simple unity, produce the soul. Thus the people is one individuality in its essence. In religion, it is pictured, worshipped, and enjoyed as God in his essence. In art, it is displayed in imagery and vision. In philosophy, it is recognized and comprehended as thought. Because of the fundamental identity of their substance, their content and object, these configurations stand in an indissoluble unity with the spirit of the state. The form of the state as we know it can exist only in the context of an definite religion, just as only this philosophy and only this art can exist in this state. Moreover, the determinate national spirit is only one individual in the course of world history, for world history is the displaying of the divine, the absolute development of spirit in its highest forms. In this sequence of stages, it attains self-consciousness, which is its truth. The configurations of these stages are the world historical national spirits, the determinate shapes of their ethical life, their form of government, their art, religion, and philosophy. The boundless drive of the world spirit, its irresistible thrust, is towards the realization of these stages. For this articulation of stages, together with their realization, comprise the concept of spirit. World history only shows us how the world spirit comes gradually to the consciousness of truth, and the willing of it. This consciousness and will dawns in the spirit. Spirit finds its main points, and in the end it arrives at full consciousness.